William Wordsworth's I Wandered Lonely as a Cloud is another of the most famous poems of the Romantic period. It embodies many of the features we stereotypically associate with Romanticism, from the solitary wanderer to the love of nature that's expressed in the poem. The poem consists of 4 stanzas rhymed A, B, A, B, C, C, and is written in iambic tetrameter, so the lines are short. It has a lilting kind of rhythm to it, and the stanza form doesn't really correspond to any specific type of poem, so it has a sort of spontaneity to it. The first line, I wandered lonely as a cloud, introduces the idea of the stereotypical romantic wanderer, the poet, communing with nature by himself. And the description of the daffodils, they are personified, a host of golden daffodils, a host being a word usually describing a large group, such as an army. They're dancing in the breeze or tossing their heads in sprightly dance. So the daffodils are quite thoroughly personified. It's as if they are another human being character in the poem. But there's kind of a twist in the poem at the end of stanza 3. The poet says, I gazed and gazed, but little thought what wealth the show to me had brought. He's saying, on the one hand, how happy the daffodils make him, but even in his happiness, he doesn't really understand the value of the experience. And the final stanza explains that a little bit more. They flash upon that inward eye, which is the bliss of solitude. So the pleasure that the daffodils bring to his eyes when he sees them is one thing, but the pleasure that they bring to his inward eye is even greater. And it's this quality of reflection that is very important to Wordsworth in particular, and in the Romantics in general. That we'll see many of the poets on this course who emphasize that quality of reflecting on experience, not just experiencing it. Wordsworth defines poetry, and we'll talk about this later in the course, as the spontaneous overflow of powerful feeling that is, however, recollected in tranquility. So the idea here that one does not craft a poem, as I suggested last week, the 18th century saw poetry as a kind of craft, but rather it emerges in this sort of spontaneous but also reflective way from the mind. It's a kind of mental birth. So again, this poem embodies many of the stereotypes of Romanticism, but they're complicated somewhat by the fact that, first of all, and you can see this in the way your textbook prints the poem, first of all, the fact that the empirical Wordsworth, the existing poet, as distinct from the speaker of this poem, was not, in fact, lonely as a cloud during this experience. It describes a walk that he took with his sister Dorothy. And Dorothy wrote in her journal about this experience before Wordsworth wrote the poem. So you can see here Dorothy's words. When we were in the woods beyond Gowbarrow Park, we saw a few daffodils close to the waterside. We fancied that the sea had floated the seeds ashore and that the little colony had sprung up. But as we went along, there were more and more and yet more. And at last, under the boughs of the trees, we saw that there was a long belt of them along the shore, about the breadth of a country turnpike road. I never saw daffodils so beautiful. They grew among the mossy stones about and above them. Some rested their heads upon these stones as on a pillow for weariness, and the rest tossed and reeled and danced and seemed as if they verily laughed with the wind that blew upon them over the lake. They looked so gay, ever glancing, ever changing. So we can see how the poem seems to be inspired by some of Dorothy's ideas. She personifies the daffodils. She has them tossing and dancing and happy. So this entry seems to have inspired William's poem. So one question to take from this is, what is the relative literary value of these two documents? Why is William's poem considered a classic when nobody really reads Dorothy's journal? Is it the poetic qualities that William gives to these ideas? Perhaps, although Dorothy's language is arguably quite beautiful too. And it will certainly be worth bearing this discussion in mind when we talk more about William Wordsworth's theory of poetry. And it's also worth bearing in mind how often the romantic ideal of the individual self that we're going to come across throughout this course, the individual, the solitary poet separated from the rest of the world, we start to see how often that is in fact belied by other factors. We will see a lot of solitary figures in this course who maybe aren't quite as solitary as they want us to believe. So it's always worth looking critically at some of these the way in which Wordsworth and some of the other poets cultivate these stereotypes of the romantic individual.